it still wasn't a sure thing that we were going to win the war in the autumn of 1943. It was a very dark time in American history, and also a very interesting time for professional football. The NFL barely survived World War II, and part of the reason really was because of the Steagles and being able to keep a franchise alive and keep the league alive.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Thank you, professional announcer guy, as always. Hi, I'm Tim Hanlon. I am the host, the curator of this here little podcast we call Good Seats Still Available. Thank you for joining me. This is the podcast, as you know, that we explore what used to be in professional sports. Today, my guest is Matthew Algeo, who is the author of a wonderful book about a team that existed in 1943 and is a forgotten footnote in pro football sports history, but one very worth telling, and you're going to hear why in a minute. Matthew's book is called Last Team Standing: How the Steelers and the Eagles, the Steagles, saved pro football during World War II. It's a fascinating conversation. It's an even more fascinating story. And Matthew's got a whole bunch of anecdotes and interesting tidbits in the process of writing this book and the story behind it. Before we get to the conversation, I do want to remind everybody, please go to goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find out what's going on with this wacky little show and find out just exactly how to follow and learn more about all the things that we're doing. Social media, we are on Twitter at GoodSeatsStill. We're on Facebook as well. You'll find a page for Good Seats Still Available there. We're also on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You can also send us email and all that kind of stuff at the website. And you can subscribe to us just about wherever good podcasts are found. That's clearly iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn. You can grab the RSS feeds. They're all out there. Wherever you get us, though, we do appreciate your comments, your inquiries, your curiosities, and of course, your ratings and reviews. Please, if you like the show, please, by all means, do so. If you don't like the show, just send me an email and we'll try to figure out why, but you don't have to put that online. And we thank you for your great support thus far. All right, let's waste no more time. Let's get to Matthew Algeo. He is the author of Last Team Standing: How the Steelers and the Eagles, the Steagles, saved pro football during World War II. And again, if you are a Philadelphia Eagles fan today, if you are a Pittsburgh Steelers fan today, and you don't know the story about the Steagles, give a listen because you're going to learn a lot, as I did. Thank you. And I guess one great way to start with our listeners is, even though our listeners may think that you sound like you're next door, you're actually not. You want to tell our listeners where you're calling in from?
I am in the capital of Mozambique, which I'm sure all your listeners know is Maputo. And I am here because my wife is a U.S. Foreign Service officer, and she worked at the U.S. Embassy here. She's the public affairs officer at the embassy here in Maputo. And we've been here about 2 years, and we'll be leaving in just a few weeks, actually, in early June. So I guess I'm probably your first guest from Maputo.
Well, that's fascinating, and it just shows, hopefully, our fledgling little podcast listenership group, just the extent by which we will reach out and continue to pursue our perverse obsession with teams and leagues and those kinds of stories that don't exist anymore. So I thank you for.
Well, you have a global reach already,
which is just fantastic. So tell your friends in the on the peninsula there. We appreciate it. So Matthew, why don't you just maybe the best place to start is at the start. How did you first come across this, the team story of the Steagles? What attracted you to it and convinced you that it was a story worth writing about?
Yeah, I'm originally from the Philadelphia area, so I kind of always knew, I grew up a big Eagles fan, and I always knew about the Steagles, kind of as the answer to a trivia question. During the war, the Eagles, the Steelers merged. And I really didn't think much more about it until 2003. And in 2003, the Steelers, in a preseason game with the Eagles Steelers preseason game in Pittsburgh, they had a ceremony to mark the 60th anniversary of the Steagles. And at the time, I was a public radio reporter. I was in Maine. I worked at Maine Public Radio, but I also freelanced for NPR programs. And there's an NPR program called Only a Game. And I pitched the story to them. I thought it'd be cool to go to this preseason game where the Steagles would be commemorated and interview some of the old players and do a story about it. And they agreed. So I went to Pittsburgh, and it was neat. I got to stand on the sidelines during the game, and they came out at halftime. And after the game, I was able to interview, I think 6 of the Steagles were there in 2003. And I did the story for Only a Game, and really thought that there might be something longer worth doing, a longer story. And I had an agent, a literary agent I still have, and I told her the idea, and she thought it was kind of cool. And so we put together a proposal and sent it out to publishers, and Da Capo Press bought the idea. And so I was able then to spend about a year doing a lot more research on the project and going back and interviewing the players again, and a couple of the players who weren't in Pittsburgh. And at the end of that process, I had this book.
How, though, did you sort of stumble sort of into the sort of rich history? Because frankly, it feels like without some longer treatment like you've done in your book, it was almost sort of an asterisk or a footnote in the history of 2 of the legacy teams of the NFL, the Steelers and the Eagles.
Yeah, well, as I began to do the research for the book proposal and then for the book itself, I think what really fascinated me was the larger context, which was life on the home front during World War II. I'm 50 years old. This is all well before I was born, but really in my parents' lifetime. My dad was a World War II vet, and I'd never really thought much about what life was really like, day-to-day life on the home front. And another aspect of it was researching the draft and how the military draft worked, and how did it come to be that these guys could play NFL football when we needed so many young men for the military, and doing research about the deferments for the draft. A lot of these guys were not physically able to be in the military, but still could play in the NFL. And so I think, like, kind of going beyond just the as you put it, the asterisk that the Steagles were, and looking at the larger context of the times in America in the middle of World War II. It still wasn't a sure thing that we were going to win the war in the autumn of 1943. It was a very dark time in American history, and also a very interesting time for professional football. The NFL barely survived World War II, and part of the reason really was because of the Steagles and being able to keep a franchise alive and keep the league alive. And so I found a lot of material also beyond the Steagles about the rest of the NFL and really all of professional sports during World War II. So I really found it to be a fascinating time in American history. And I think so many, when we talk about that time, we're so really preoccupied with the war, as well we should be. But, there was a whole other story going on here at home in the United States at that time. And I think I found that to be a really fascinating part of the Steagles story.
Well, the Steagles themselves were part of the 1943 NFL season, but perhaps you can enlighten our listeners a bit into sort of the prelude to that situation, maybe a couple of years prior. Obviously, the U.S. and its participation in the war was not necessarily solidified in 39 or 40, but obviously there were some things that sort of preceded the Steagles coming into being, and perhaps you can maybe set the stage a bit.
Yeah, well, I think the most interesting place to start is December 7th, 1941, which of course is the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was a Sunday and happened to be the last day of the NFL regular season. So a lot of people learned that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and that the United States was entering World War II by listening to a football game, or maybe even were at the stadium. The Eagles were playing the Redskins in Washington that Sunday, and a lot of service members were at the game. One of them was a young Navy officer, John F. Kennedy. And of course, there were a lot of bigwigs at the game in Washington. And as the game proceeded, more and more of them were paged to go back to their office. And Sammy Ball talked about how he'd never heard so many pages during a game, and everybody wondered what the hell was going on. But the players had no idea. Of course, the people listening on the radio and a lot of people at the ballpark knew what had happened, but the players on the field had no idea. And the stadium was half empty by the time the game ended, and they just wondered what had happened. And it wasn't until they got back to the locker rooms that they found out that the United States was really in all likelihood going to war. 1942 then was the first full season that the NFL played during the war. And they were really able to make a go of things, mainly because they really hadn't ramped up the draft the way it would ramp up in 1943 and 1944. Fathers were still exempt, for one thing, and especially a lot of the better teams like the Bears and the Giants had a lot of fathers on the team, and so they didn't lose as many players. It really was in 1943 that the draft really started to increase. And I talk in the book, one of the interesting things researching, I say if truth is the first casualty in war, then the second casualty is the physical requirements for men to be inducted into the Army, because at the beginning of the war, the requirements were very stringent. About 40% of men who were inducted in 1940 were rejected as unfit for military service. But as the war progressed, the standards progressively got lower and lower, and more men were accepted as fit for service. And so the NFL by 1943 was really facing a critical manpower shortage. In the summer of 43, the Steelers only had 6 players under contract, and the Brooklyn Dodgers, who were a football team, an NFL team at the time, the owners weren't very imaginative about names, really. But the Dodgers had 0 players under contract at one point in the summer of 43. So it became very apparent to the NFL that they were going to have to do something drastic to keep the league alive.
I especially love in the beginning of your book, which, as our listeners already know, but we'll plug away again early and often, is Last Team Standing, how the Steelers and Eagles saved pro football during World War II, obviously called the Steagles. The fascinating part that you start the book off with is the roster of the team. They're not only their positions and their other vitals, but their draft status that got them basically chosen for the team, which were obviously very low rankings, which I thought was just a tremendous scene setter for the issues of whether they were whether they were actually going to go to war or not.
Yeah, thanks. I did a lot of research to find out the draft status of all the Steagles. A lot of the newspapers, the Philadelphia and the Pittsburgh papers at the time, would mention somebody's draft status as an aside while reporting on a game. And so I was able to get the draft status of a lot of the players from the newspaper, but some I actually made requests. You can request service records and draft records from the government. And so I was able to get a lot of the players' draft status through that, and also through interviews with the surviving players. And they helped fill in a lot of the blanks. It was really one of the most interesting parts about researching the book was how the draft worked. There was a draft lottery where they just picked a number out of a big barrel, and everybody who was born on that particular date was drafted, and then they just went down through all the dates and all the numbers, and it was all judged by your birthday. So if you got a low number, you were likely to be inducted. A number, you were less likely. And so it was that the Steagles had a lot of players who were 4F. That was the designation for somebody who was not physically fit for military service, but in many cases you could still play football perfectly fine. For example, a player with a perforated eardrum would not be eligible for military service, but could play NFL football. And so really a lot of it hinged on what a player's draft status was as to whether or not they'd be playing pro football or being in the Army overseas.
So that didn't necessarily come with guilt-free feeling, right? It seems like they were certainly weighing on not only the players, but perhaps even some of the fans, while the world's at war and the United States is a major sacrifice and people are basically sending, putting their lives on the line to help defend the country. You've got this seemingly frivolous exercise called football, and these folks are basically allowed to play it. So there's a little story about Bill Hewitt in there. Maybe that's an example, perhaps?
Yeah, and there were several examples, and I asked the Steagles when I spoke with them about this. There were a lot of conflicting feelings, both among the players and among the fans. The Steagles were the only team in the NFL at the time that required their players to all work in defense jobs during the week and then play football on Sunday. So the Steagles players were all contributing to the war effort fairly directly. They were working at aviation factories, shipyards. Ted Doyle, who played on the team, he was working at the Westinghouse factory in Pittsburgh. He later learned he was helping build equipment that enriched uranium for the nuclear bombs. And so in some ways that really kind of mitigated the feelings of guilt I think that a lot of the players had. Still, you couldn't help but feel a little guilty at being able to play what you're right, this frivolous thing called football, at the same time that all your friends from college had gone off to war and gone overseas. And a lot of the other players in the NFL, some 600 NFL players, served in World War II. And I think 15 of them died in service. So, yeah, there was guilt on the part of the players. And at the same time, the fans also wondered why these big husky guys weren't overseas fighting for their country. And there was some abuse hurled at the players. You mentioned Bill Hewitt. He was an interesting guy. He had played in the NFL back in the 1930s. And he had actually retired, and the Eagles brought him out of retirement. He had never worn a helmet before. That's how long it had been since Bill Hewitt had played. And when he came to the Steagles, he was required to wear a helmet for the first time. I think he was about 35 years old at the time. He was exempt from military service. I believe he was a father at the time. He was also a little on the old side. And so he came back to play for the Steagles and actually didn't play very well. He had been one of the great NFL players. I think he's in the Hall of Fame now, but he was past his prime. But these were the kinds of players that the NFL really depended on. Old guys who came out of retirement, young guys who couldn't serve in the military. And it's really how the NFL got by during the war.
Well, so playing NFL football was obviously deemed not a frivolous exercise. In fact, you had the president of the United States, FDR, touting baseball, for example, as a needed distraction, I think was the quote from your book. And I know the NFL was certainly not anything what it is today in terms of stature and grandiosity, but I suspect that the owners of the NFL, in particular a certain owner, which we could probably now segue into, believed that football as a distraction was something of somewhat of a salve, if you will, for the nation's tensions.
Yes, you're right. The NFL in 1943 was not quite the institution it is today. And it was a very, very distant, I don't even know if you would say second to Major League Baseball. College football was actually much more popular than NFL football in the mid-1940s. But the owners did feel that there was something to be gained by keeping the game alive during the war, and not just for their own financial gain. In fact, the war years were not very lucrative financially for most of the owners of the NFL teams. And one owner in particular who was eager to keep the game going was Art Rooney, who was the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. in 1943. In fact, he was the owner since the team was founded 10 years earlier in 1933. And in 1942, the Steelers had their best season ever. They had their first winning record. And so Art Rooney was really eager to keep the team going in 1943. He wanted to give the fans something. They'd had this great season in 1942, but as I mentioned earlier, by the summer of 43, they only had about 6 players under contract. And so Rooney had to come up with Plan B, and that was when he approached Lex Thompson, who was the owner of the Eagles, and suggested merging the Steelers and the Eagles. And Lex Thompson wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea, but eventually he agreed. He actually owed Rooney a favor. He had helped Thompson take control of the Eagles a couple years before, and so this is how it came to be that the owner of the Steelers, Art Rooney, who actually owned the team with Bert Bell. They were co-owners. They came to team up with Lex Thompson and formed the Steagles.
Well, so when that sort of happened, it seems like it also didn't come together very easily. You spent some time talking about the battle of the two legacy coaches of both the Eagles and the Steelers, and it's obviously not easy to get them to basically work with each other, having basically been competitors prior.
Yeah. Well, the first roadblock was getting the rest of the teams to approve this merger. So what had happened in the summer of 43 between the 42 and 43 seasons was the NFL had been 12 teams, and then the Cleveland Rams had to suspend operations in the summer of 43. I think they had 2 owners who were both serving overseas at the time in the military. And so there was really nobody left to run the Rams. And so they had to suspend operations. And that reduced the league to 9 teams. I'm sorry, there were originally 10 teams. The Rams suspend operation. It goes down to 9 teams, and that's really not a very convenient number for scheduling. And there still was a shortage of players, and so it was decided that 2 teams should merge. And the best candidates really for merging in 1943 would have been the 2 teams in Chicago, the Bears and the Cardinals, who played in Chicago at that time. But the Bears were defending champions, and the rest of the owners didn't think it was very fair for them to just skim off the best players on the Cardinals, and so that was denied, that petition to merge the 2 Chicago teams, and so it came up then for the 2 Pennsylvania teams to merge. And again, there was a lot of discussion about whether this was fair or not, since the Steelers had been so good in 42, but it passed by a vote of 5-4, and it was approved for the Steelers and the Eagles to merge. And then when you had training camp, you suddenly had these 2 teams that had been bitter foes the year before, now united. And this caused some problems. There was an informal agreement that a certain number of Steelers would be in the starting lineup. And so you had a guy like Ray Graves had been the starting center for the Eagles in 1942, and he came to training camp in 43, and suddenly he was second string behind the Steelers center. So there was a lot of dissension among the players at the beginning. And then, of course, mostly, as you alluded to, was the tension between the coaches. What they did is they named the Steelers head coach, Walt Kiesling, and the Eagles head coach, Greasy Neal, co-head coaches. And that went over about as well as you would expect it to go over today. And it was a terrible arrangement. These 2 guys didn't like each other, for one thing. They had completely different philosophies on coaching, for another. Walt Kiesling was an old school 3 yards and a cloud of dust guy. Greasy Neal was a big proponent of the newfangled T formation that Hallis had instituted in Chicago. And so there was a lot of tension among the players and the coaches on the Steagles in training camp and as the season began.
It seems like there was while I guess set up to be a somewhat quote unquote merger of equals. I guess a modern day example would be the attempted merger of equals between United Airlines and Continental, where it seems like they're trying to do one piece from each team to sort of keep it somewhat equitable. It does seem, though, that despite Art Rooney and the Steelers being sort of the originators of this idea, I guess, by default, it almost feels like the Eagles sort of had a little bit of an advantage in terms of I guess the colors that were used and some of the other things. No, home game numbers.
Rooney and his partner Bert Bell did not come into these negotiations from a very advantageous position. I mean, the Steelers had so few players under contract, they had no leverage. The Eagles had 16 players under contract, which wasn't enough, but of course enough to at least field the team. And so Lex Thompson, the Eagles owner, and Lex was a different kind of guy among NFL owners at the time. You know, at the time, a lot of NFL owners would just name their team after the baseball team in town. And we mentioned the Brooklyn Dodgers. The original name of the Pittsburgh Steelers was the Pittsburgh Pirates. The Redskins were the Redskins because in Boston, the baseball team was the Braves. So these weren't very original thinking guys a lot of the time, and they didn't understand marketing. Well, Lex Thompson, he sold a brand of eye drops and sold 1 million bottles of these eye drops a year. So he knew a thing or two about marketing. So when they began negotiating the nitty gritty of the merger, Lex was very protective of the Eagles brand, and so he basically dictated the terms. And among the terms were that the team would wear green and white uniforms for all games. The only year that the Steelers have not worn the black and gold was 1943, when the Steagles wore the Eagles green and white uniforms. There were 6 home games in 1943. 4 of the home games were in Philadelphia, only 2 home games at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. So a lot of the fans in Pittsburgh ended up feeling like this really wasn't a Pittsburgh team at all. They weren't wearing the Steelers colors. They were only playing 2 home games. And so Rooney and Bell, as the Steelers owners, really had to work hard to drum up support and enthusiasm for the merger. But, like I said, Rooney had no choice. He pretty much was at Lex Thompson's mercy when it came to accepting the terms of the merger.
Now, what was the actual name of the team? Because I think it sounds to me that Steagles was kind of a nickname that maybe wasn't even the official name and was sort of adopted, as the season went on, or maybe even in hindsight.
Right. This was another thing. At first, Lex Thompson insisted the team be known as the Philadelphia Eagles. And this did not go over very well. And even the league, I think, thought this was not a great idea. So at first, they decided to call the team just the Eagles with no city designation. They ended up being known officially as the Philadelphia Pittsburgh Combine, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. And it was inevitable and also hard to fit Philadelphia Pittsburgh Combine into a headline. And so the newspapers really, I think it was 4 days after the merger was announced, one of the Pittsburgh newspapers began calling the team the Steagles. There were other nicknames that were put around. Phil-Pitt, Steaglers was another one, but really Steagles was the one name that really seemed to stick. And by the first week of the season, even the New York Times was referring to the team as the Steagles, although officially the NFL still calls the team Phil-Pitt. Is how the team is listed in the record books. And when I was researching the book, the NFL still had not even registered the name Steagles as a trademark, which is kind of amazing considering how protective the NFL is of all its properties. And so the NFL never really acknowledged the name Steagles, although all the fans and all the newspapers did. And so it's kind of an interesting, what's the word, etymology? What's the word for when you figure out how a word began? But it's interesting how the Steagles came to be known as the Steagles, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the team. How did they do? It seems like they basically held their own quite well, despite all the tenuous circumstances, huh?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give away too much. You got to buy the book to find out how it all
By the way, folks,
out.
The book again is Last Team Standing: How the Steelers and the Eagles, the Steagles, saved pro football during World War II, and you'll be able to find that on our website, of course, and wherever fine books are sold. But make no mistake, Matthew, we encourage our listeners to learn more, no doubt.
They could also just Google Steagles and find out. The Steagles actually finished with a record of 5-4-1, which was the first winning season that the Philadelphia Eagles franchise had ever had, and only the second winning season that the Steelers had ever had. So they really exceeded all expectations. If they'd won their final game against the Packers in Philadelphia at Shibe Park, they actually would have finished in a three-way tie for first place in the Eastern Division. So they fell just a game short of actually making the playoffs. There would have been a playoff for first place. And so it was really kind of a magical season in a way. They opened the season with a game in Brooklyn against the Dodgers, and finished the game holding the Dodgers. Actually, I'm sorry, the game was actually in Philadelphia, that first game. They held the Dodgers to minus 33 yards rushing, which I think is still the third best single game defensive performance in NFL history. They played the Redskins twice, and the Redskins were a powerhouse. They tied them in Philadelphia and then actually beat them second to last week of the season in Washington, which was a phenomenal upset and a very gratifying day for the Eagles quarterback Roy Zimmerman, who was a cast-off from the Redskins. And so as the season progressed as well, they got bigger and bigger crowds. They started out the season with about a crowd of 11,000 in Philadelphia, and then the final game of the season against the Packers was a sellout, 34,000 at Old Shibe Park in Philadelphia. So really, from a standpoint of the success on the field and success off the field at the box office, they exceeded all expectations.
Well, you also had some very interesting legacies that came out of that team. I mean, you mentioned Ray Graves earlier. He indeed made it to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1971. Obviously, a bit past his previous prime by coming into the team, but obviously somebody of great note and lore in the NFL's history. But you had some. You mentioned Ray Graves before. I mean, Ray Graves, based on my research, and we go to great lengths, Matthew, to entertain and educate our audience, was basically in the mix in the University of Florida football program, and was the guy who green-lighted or green-lit, whatever the term is, the test and then ultimate follow-through of Gatorade for his thirsty team, right?
Yeah, he was the head coach at University of Florida, and then he was athletic director for a long time after that as well. And Ray, there were some researchers working on products to combat dehydration, and they asked Ray if they could use some of the Florida Gators players as guinea pigs for researching this product, which later came to be known as Gatorade. And I believe the University of Florida still receives royalties for Gatorade for the name. Ray, I interviewed him, and he was quick to point out, though, that he personally never got any royalties for Gatorade, unfortunately.
Well, it's unfortunate, but he did give him the opportunity to do so, and that's it's not only a footnote; it's a significant footnote, I guess, in the history not only of the NFL but of pro sports in general. And then you also had, having grown up in the New York metropolitan area myself, people know Allie Sherman mostly from his New York Giants days, but he went on to be quite a successful sports executive, even to the interest of myself and our listeners. Part of the New York Cosmos soccer team back in the 1970s and early 80s in the NASL, including a strong relationship with Pele in his final game and all that kind of stuff. So he too was on the team and quite revered in his football days afterwards.
Yeah, he was a short guy, not a big guy at all, and I think I have him here in the book. 5'10", 160, played quarterback, and he had a perforated eardrum, which is why he was not fit for military service. Perforated eardrum, if there is a nerve gas or some kind of poisonous gas attack on the battlefield, perforated eardrum, the gas could obviously it would be very very deadly. That's why people with perforated eardrums were rejected for military service. Not the biggest guy, not the strongest guy, but a really, really knowledgeable football guy. And he sort of was taken under Greasy Neal's wing. Greasy was the head coach of the Eagles, and really sort of learned at Greasy's knee. And as you mentioned, went on to become head coach. I think the Giants won 3 consecutive NFL Eastern Conference championships in the early 60s, but I guess it was the Vince Lombardi's Packers were so dominant then. And later, I think Ali was in a group that was trying to buy the New York Jets.
Correct.
Ali, I think, had a fairly good post-football career in finance.
And I believe that's when that process, that pursuit is when he met a young and aspirant Steve Ross, then the chairman of Warner Communications, or becoming such. And that I think the loss of that NFL pursuit was what spurred Ross onto getting an ASL franchise and trying to basically get this pro sports thing, but without having to being able to get into the NFL club, so to speak. A Donald Trump, for example, would have done the same thing in the early 80s with the USFL. Again, we digress, right. But it's an interesting seed of other sports stuff to come afterwards.
Well, it was really interesting to see what happened to these guys. Some of them went on to have very long and distinguished NFL careers. Al Wistert, who was one of my favorite guys to interview, he was a rookie in 1943. He played at Michigan, broke his wrist while he was playing at Michigan. He was a tackle, broke his wrist playing at Michigan, and they detected osteomyelitis in his X-rays at his when he was drafted, and that's a bone disease. It's an infection, and it can be fatal. And so he was rejected for military service. Went on to have a long career with the Eagles. He was captain of the 2 championship teams in 48 and 49, and a lot of people think he should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And he was actually the very last of the Steagles to pass away. I think 2 or 3 years ago, Al passed away, so none of the Steagles are around. But all these guys, Ernie Steele, another guy I love, halfback, he retired to Seattle and opened up a bar, a cocktail lounge, as they called them in Seattle at the time, up on Capitol Hill in Seattle, and it became a favorite hangout of the grunge scene in the 90s, Ernie Steele's, and is mentioned actually in a song by the band, the Presidents of the United States of America. So yeah, it was really interesting to see how these guys' lives played out even long after the Steagles.
So when you interviewed them and met them during the reunion and all that, what were was there a uniform kind of reaction to sort of the memories? I mean, were they mostly happy ones? Were they wistful? Were they, random? What was the feeling? Were they happy to be back together again? Was there any sort of camaraderie?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I think, especially after 60 years, any of the old animosities had long since faded. I think it was like any kind of reunion for them. I think when I interviewed them at the stadium in Pittsburgh, I just blanked on it. What is it, Heinz Field?
Correct.
At Heinz Field, it was sort of a kind of a rushed thing. Backstage, kind of got stock answers. It was really when I followed up and went to visit them, most of them in their homes, and was able to really sit and talk, for an hour, even a couple hours, that you really sort of peeled back the stock answers and were able to get to what it really felt like at the time. Like I mentioned, there was some animosity, especially at the beginning of the season. There was a competition between the Steelers and the Eagles, and each team was really loyal to its own head coach, and there was the tension between the coaches. And so I was really happy. I think I got some really honest answers, not just the usual anecdotes that I'm sure they've repeated 100 times, but really, so to answer your question, it was a whole range. I think people did remember the animosity, but they looked back at the time very fondly. They were all very proud of the role they played and having played in the National Football League, and and they all had very strong opinions about what football is like today. So it was a lot of fun talking to these guys.
Do you think there's a movie in here somewhere? I'm sure you've thought about optioning, or it's not, it's certainly crossed your mind, but it feels like this is a great story that could be, in today's Hollywood, a really good one.
Man, I hope so. I can report this is a world exclusive. We just sold the rights for a movie based on the book last week to a couple of brothers who are actors in Los Angeles, who are originally from Pittsburgh and knew the story very well. Sony Pictures had bought the rights and held the rights for 5 or 6 years. But, it's so many stories get bought in Hollywood, and so few movies ever actually end up getting made. I think it would be a fantastic movie. Myself, obviously, I'm a little biased, but I think it would be a great movie. The movie Leatherheads came out probably now 8 or 9 years ago, and I guess that didn't do so well. So that set the football movies back a little bit. But I really think not just for the story of the Steagles, but like I talked about earlier, the story of life on the home front. When I interviewed the players, I also interviewed their wives, who were surviving at the time. And the stories they told were fascinating about trying to find shoes for their kids and trading ration stamps, which was actually prohibited. It was illegal, but everybody did it because the family that had 6 kids always needed shoes, and the family that only had 1 kid across the street could afford to give their shoe ration coupons away. So it's not just a football story. I think it's a bigger story than that, and I'd love to see it be made into a movie. I think it'd be really cool.
Well, congratulations. And of course, talk about burying the lead. That's an amazing piece of information. Do you have any idea as to, and we know how slowly and tortuously Hollywood can be with these kinds of projects. Do you have any sense of how this may be developed and when and timing?
No, I don't. I'm really hopeful, though, that when Sony bought the rights, I was very excited because I thought, well, Sony, geez. And then I kind of learned that, what a big studio like that does is buys 1,000 stories a year, and one of them gets made into a movie, that kind of thing. And I think the guys who are interested in it now are real football fans, real Steelers fans in particular. And I think they really like the story. So I'm really hopeful that something, even in the next year or two, will happen in terms of them finishing a script and being able to shop it around. I certainly did not get into writing a book about the Steagles to get rich, and it's a good thing because I have not. And I'm finding out that this little story of professional football history has a fairly narrow appeal, but if people really see the bigger story, they would really enjoy it. And I have to say, getting to know, there's an organization called Professional Football Researchers Association, PFRA, and these are the guys who are like Sabre, Sabre for baseball. Yeah. So they're the Sabre guys for football, and They do an amazing job, and talk about a labor of love. I mean, going back through box scores from the 20s and 30s, and there's so much in NFL history we don't even know. I mean, there's in the early days of the NFL, going back to the 20s, I mean, teams just scheduled games wherever and whenever they could. Even in 1943, the week before the Packers played the Steagles at Shibe Park, the Packers played an exhibition game against a semi-pro team. I mean, there were games going on that they still aren't even sure, where they were played or who won. And that's what these guys in the Professional Football Researchers Association do. And so they were really helpful, and the Hall of Fame was really helpful too. It was really cool to go to the Pro Football Hall of Fame and look back at the meeting minutes for the NFL owners meetings from the 1940s and just read through those. It was really fun researching.
Well, I hopefully you will invite all of those folks as well as yours truly for the red carpet premiere, because I agree. I think it's a tremendous story writ large, beyond just sort of the narrow fandom of pro football history. One last thing I'll throw out there, and maybe I sort of put this as a postscript, but it seems to me that after the end of the 43 season, and the war and the drafting process seemed to be somewhat stabilizing, at least in terms of how the home front was going to prepare and help support the war effort. It didn't stop, apparently, the other teams from merging as well in a subsequent year. And maybe you can sort of explain 1944 and a, shall we call them, less successful merged team that kind of followed in their footsteps, no?
Yeah. So after the 43 season, the Eagles owner, Lex Thompson, decided to go his own way again. 1944. As I mentioned, Lex was a real sensitive to branding and marketing, and he had never been a big fan of the merger. And so after the 43 season, the Steelers were still in desperate need of players. The Eagles declined to merge with them again, and so the Steelers had to find another partner to merge with in 1944, and they merged with the Chicago Cardinals. And that team was known rather, it's not very poetic, I guess, Card Pit. Card Pit was the name of the team, and they managed to go 0-10 and are widely acknowledged as one of the worst teams in NFL history. I think a couple of the players were fined for, quote, indifference in 1944, and Card Pit actually has come to be known as the Carpets because everybody walked all over them. So it was not a very successful merger in 1944 for Art Rooney and Bert Bell. But again, it was important to keep the league alive. And my own personal daydream, of course, is that someday there will be a Steelers-Eagles Super Bowl, and of course, my book will be featured prominently at halftime. But as close as I've come to this daydream is the Steelers-Cardinals Super Bowl a few years ago, and there were a couple articles about Card Pit in the papers when the Steelers and the Cardinals met in the Super Bowl, but still waiting for that Steelers-Eagles Super Bowl.
Well, perhaps that happens before the movie, or maybe the movie happens before that, or perhaps they happen during the same year. Wouldn't that be interesting? So before we wrap up, I do want to thank you again from all the way from Mozambique to be with us on this. You want to give us some sense of what you're currently working on outside of this sort of reminiscence and book from the past. What other things do keep you busy, and what might you be doing when you come back in the States? Are you authoring other works? Do you have other interests?
Yeah, actually, I have a book coming out. It came out a couple of years ago, but it's coming out in paperback this fall. And it's a book that I kind of discovered while I was doing the research for the Steagles book. And I was doing research into the history of spectator sports in the United States. And while I was doing that, I came across a sport called pedestrianism, which was very popular in the 1870s and 1880s. And these were long-distance walking matches. And the most popular version of this sport was the 6-day walking match. You couldn't play sports or do any kind of amusements on Sundays at the time because of the Sabbath. And so these walking matches would take place inside arenas. They begin right after midnight, Sunday night, Monday morning, and they continue right up to midnight the following Saturday night. And whoever walked the most miles in 6 days was the winner. And so they'd put a little dirt floor, dirt track, maybe a sixth of a mile around on the floor of Madison Square Garden, for example. And these guys would walk in circles for 6 days, and 10,000 people a night would come out to just watch them walk in circles. And the winner might do 500 or 600 miles in a week. and the payouts were huge. These guys would take home $20,000. Back in 1880, this is it's the equivalent of $500,000 for a week's worth of work. And so pedestrianism is kind of where my mind is at right now. And I'm also thinking about doing another book for my next book. It's about the around the world flight that Wiley Post did. Do you know who Wiley Post was?
I do not.
He was the guy who was piloting the plane that crashed with Will Rogers in 1935.
Interesting.
So Wiley Post was a very famous pilot in the 30s, and he was the first pilot to fly around the world. He did it in 8 days, and was really as famous as Lindbergh in his day, but unfortunately he died in the crash with Will Rogers in 1935. And so I think it'd be cool to do a story about this around the world flight in 1931. And so he flew from New York to London to Berlin to Moscow. So he's really visiting some interesting places for 1931. And it would be a good excuse for me to take a tax-deductible trip around the world, too.
I think that's an awesome idea. I also want to tell our listeners before we let Matthew go that we, in the preparation for this conversation, we bonded over our interest in the old North American Soccer League and the lamentable, I guess, to some extent, Philadelphia Fury in the late 70s, and shared a couple of videos and stuff. So I guess there's no real story there to be had in terms of a book, but I do reserve the right to send you YouTube videos as I come across them along the line.
I would actually, I think, I just read. What's the is it called Rock and Roll Soccer?
Yeah, Ian Pundelith he's certainly somebody on my list to pursue as we get going. Yeah.
And I thought it was a really good book. I think the Fury would be a great team to focus on just because of the whole aspect of the ownership group. And I have to say I was 12 years old in 1978, and I was a huge soccer fan. Everybody thought soccer was going to be the sport of the 80s, and I have to say I was a big Phillies fan, and I remember sending a baseball card to Mike Schmidt to have him sign it and mail it back. And of course, I never saw the card again. But I also sent a letter to Tony Glavine, who was on the
Pocket
Fury,
Rocket.
The Pocket Rocket. And I got back, and I still have it, a 2-page handwritten note from Tony Glavine, and just thanking me for my interest. And if I come to a game, let him know, and he'd like to meet me. And now Tony is a Facebook friend of mine. He's in St. Louis. He runs soccer academies out there. And there were just aspects of the end of the Fury that I just loved. I mean, I thought that was so cool. I'll always be a Philadelphia Fury fan. I'd love to get one of those uniforms, man. They were just beautiful.
Well, we have a couple of guests coming up from NASL land with hopefully some great stories. Bobby Moffett, former Dallas Tornado player for about 7-8 years, is in the midst of writing a book as well. Should be coming out in a couple of months, and we're going to be talking with him on some of these issues. So more to come, and I'm happy to share some further notes with you as we move along. But in the meantime,
who owned the Tornado? Was that
so the Tornado? The Tornado was owned by the duo of Lamar Hunt, right? Who obviously had his AFL football dalliances, and arguably was the savior of not only the AFL and its ultimate merger, but the NASL and obviously its subsequent MLS progeny. But also a guy named Bill McNutt, who, from what I understand, was a fruitcake baron. There was such a thing. He was the king of the fruitcakes, not personally, but in terms of his business line. And the two of them managed that team through the late 60s all the way until the early 80s. So it was probably one of the most legacy teams of that league, and stable. Yeah. And obviously the iron hand of Lamar Hunt being largely the reason. So, Bobby's going to be somebody who's going to be very interested and helpful. And I think he too likes to regale in some stories in the old league. And looking forward to talking to him. And he's quite the spirited character. So
I think the Adams, who were the Fury's predecessors, in '73, I think it was the Tornado that the Adams beat to win the league championship.
At Texas Stadium. You were correct, sir. And it was also on the front cover of Sports Illustrated that week as well.
Bob Rigby.
Thank you, Matthew. I can't thank you enough.
Good stuff.
Thank you. Same. Thank you, Matthew. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Okay, well, that was cool. A little extra bonus material there. A little Philadelphia Fury, NASL soccer. Always welcome on this podcast. And who knew that Matthew and I shared that sort of NASL trivia past there. So there you go. A little treat there for our soccer fans out there listening. But also, talk about burying the lead. This story, we just broke the news here on this podcast that the story that Matthew's written about the Steagles is been picked up by a studio in Hollywood and hopefully will be made into a motion picture, hopefully sooner rather than later. We'll definitely keep in touch with him as the weeks and months progress and keep our fingers crossed that a quality movie that tells the story with authenticity does result. And congratulations to him on getting that story at least sold and into the process. And we keep our fingers crossed that the movie comes out soon. In the meantime, the book that you can get out there wherever good books are sold is called Last Team Standing: How the Steelers and the Eagles, the Steagles, saved pro football during World War II. You can also get the book not only wherever good books are sold, you can find a link to it on our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. And you can also go to Matthew's website, which is Matt Algeo, which is M-A-T-T, Algeo, A-L-G-E-O, all one word, mattalgeo.com, and also see his other works as well. Thank you. Tremendous input from our listeners so far. I am amazed at how many people have been touched or influenced by our conversations thus far, and we have so much more to come. And I thank you kindly. We look forward to your listening to us in the near future. Till then, take care. Thanks.